I'm beginning to record Hannah Schink, my Auntie Hannah, and we're going to talk about our family history uh, on how our family immigrated from Sweden and,
Germany.
from Germany and made their way to Dickey Prairie. So, Hannah, go ahead and start.
Okay, well, our family came from in Germany, from southern Germany, near Slots, near or in Slotstal. It's a small community, not far from Lindingen. And my grandmother, when she was about 17 or 16 years old, went to Switzerland to work in someone's home. And while she was there, she had a letter or information from my grandfather, who was as a young man, was in Pittsburgh, close near where his brother lived. And so he went to Pittsburgh to his brother's and had a job of, I don't know what kind of a job he had, but he had a job and he worked there. And then he went out to Oregon and then came back to Pittsburgh. And sometime after that, he sent a message to my grandmother, who was still in Switzerland.
And what time about was that? What are we talking?
And
that must have been
at the very early 1880s or very late 1870s. Anyway, he came at that time, and so my grandmother then received a word that she should come to Pittsburgh to meet him. And so she did, and she got to Pittsburgh, I believe it must have been about 1880 or between 1880 and 81. And soon after she was in Pittsburgh, my grandfather and she were married. And they came on the train to Oregon. And they were in Oregon a little over a year or so when their oldest child was born. And that would have been Fritz, or Frederick.
And Fritz, that last name would have been Vogt?
And his last name was Feyrer.
Oh, Feyrer.
That was Feyrer. By that time, my grandmother's married name was Feyrer. And she married Gottlieb Feyrer. And then after Fritz was born, then there were, my Aunt Anna and my mother and another child, Joseph, I believe it was Joseph Carl. He was born in Aurora. These were all born in Aurora. And soon after that, my grandfather decided to look at the land over by Dickey Prairie. And so they looked at it and decided to purchase that in Dickey Prairie, right close to the Molalla River, about 3 miles east of Molalla. And that would have been in about 1886, I would think. 86 or 87, somewhere like that. The date is on the big plaque on the stone in Feyrer Park.
Right.
They have the date on there, the year that they came to Dickey Prairie. Did you want to go further on that one?
So, some of the things are in the museum.
And then after they came to Dickey Prairie, there was just a small log house that was still on the piece of property. And so they lived in this for some few years. And that they had another child while there, and that one was a little girl called Clara, and she's buried up not on our property, my grandparents' property, but on the neighbor's property, who had a little cemetery started already. And then after little Clara was born, then the next child in the first child in Dickey Prairie was our uncle, Gottlob Edward. and then the rest of the children were born in Dickey Prairie. And
So,
it's during those years that I think that my grandmother was very much into knitting and fixing her own wool and all. And she purchased, and my grandfather, they purchased two spinning wheels. One was a real large wheeled one, and one was a smaller one, and some call it a flax wheel instead of a wool spinning wheel. But anyway, there were these two spinning wheels that were purchased by my grandmother and grandfather, Gottlieb and Catherine Feyrer.
so Hannah, the Volk family, how does that connect to the Feyrer family?
The Volk family connects to the Feyrer family in that my grandmother, a Feyrer, and Fritz was also, he was a Vogt. The Vogt family, Gottlieb and Catherine Vogt, had five children, and the oldest was my grandmother, Catherine, and the next one was Fritz Vogt. These are Fritz, and the next one was, of course, Fritz Vogt carried his father's name of Vogt. And then the next child was Sturm, and the fourth child was Barbara. She was a Dick. And then there was a little baby that was born over in Germany and was buried in Germany.
So the Feyrer family reunions that we have, the reason we have the Sturms, the Dicks, and the Feyrers and the Vokes.
The reason when we have our family reunion, which has been over 50 years now, we call it the Feyrer family reunion because the park where we hold the family reunion is on Feyrer property, but the Gottlieb and Catherine Feyrer are the first children of Gottlieb and Maria Vogt.
Okay,
so the park is really because of one of the children of the Vogt couple.
So the Volk family never really owned land in Dickey Prairie then?
Gottlieb and Maria Vogt came to Dickey Prairie after my grandparents, Catherine and Catherine and Gottlieb came to Dickey Prairie. Then some years later, my grandparents, Catherine and Gottlieb, decided that their parents, who had now come from Germany, because all their children were here, they came over to the house that my grandparents built for them to live in, which they did until they both passed away.
And that was the grandmother's house on the corner.
And that is why we call the little house that's right close to the home house, well, we always called it grandmother's house, because my grandfather died quite a few years before my grandmother died.
Okay, that's very helpful.
And so the house was vacant then, and it was vacant for not too terribly long, I think. And then when my father was killed, then the family decided, being that the so-called grandmother house was empty, this is where my mother and her three children would live. And we did live there in grandmother's house until my grandmother died, which was only 2 years after my father was killed.
And then, my grandmother, Louise Johnson, lived with Ed and Jack Feyrer, and then you and Mom and Ellen lived in the grandmother house for a while.
Yep.
Then you moved back into Uncle Ed's house.
Yep. Then after my grandmother died, the family decided that my that my mother and we three little ones should come over into the main family home. And that's what we did. And my mother, from that year on, which would have been about 1924, because my father died in 22, and my grandmother died in 24.
How old were you when
And
your dad died in
how old
22?
was I when?
When your dad died in 22.
I was 2 years old when my father was killed. My sister Maya, or Catherine, was 4 years old, and Ellen was 22 months old when our father was killed by a horse crushing him against the wall in the barn.
And it was shortly after that when you moved into the Feyrer home.
And then when my grandmother Catherine passed away, then the family decided that we should move. My mother and we three little ones would move to the family home, and we lived in. We had a bedroom that was empty over in the big house, and that's where my mother and we three little ones stayed after we moved away from grandmother's house.
Okay. Very good. Thanks, Hannah. Love you.
And that's where we were raised.